Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something a little different. Tonight, we are not just visiting a place. We are visiting an idea, a very old idea, one that has been conquered, renamed, reborn, and reimagined so many times that even the people living inside it sometimes had to pause and ask themselves, wait, who are we exactly? Tonight, we are traveling to one of the oldest continuously inhabited regions on Earth. A place of mountain ranges so vast they look like the spine of the world itself. A place of deserts that shimmer at noon like hammered copper. A place of gardens, real gardens carefully tended, walled off from the dust and wind outside, that gave the world its very concept of paradise. Because that is actually where the word comes from. The ancient Persian word paradisa meant a walled garden, a protected, cultivated space of beauty surrounded by wildness. The Greeks borrowed it. It passed through Latin, and eventually it became the word you whisper when you imagine somewhere perfect. Paradise. That is the kind of place we're talking about tonight. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And do leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there. I love imagining all of you scattered across time zones, all finding the same quiet at slightly different hours. Now, let's begin at the beginning. The Iranian Plateau is not an easy place to live. It sits at the crossroads of Asia, Europe, and Africa, not geographically, but in terms of the endless human traffic that has always moved between those worlds. Armies, merchants, nomads, pilgrims, and refugees have been crossing this plateau for as long as people have been moving at all. The land itself is demanding. Much of it is high desert, cold at night, and blazing by day. The great salt flats in the interior, the Dashti Kavir and the Dashti Lut, are among the most inhospitable places on the planet. The Dashti Lut holds the record for the hottest surface temperature ever recorded on Earth, somewhere around 70 degrees Celsius. Hot enough to bake bread, if you were inclined to try. And yet, people have lived here for an extraordinarily long time. Archaeological evidence places human settlement on the Iranian plateau as far back as 10,000 years ago. Some of the earliest known agricultural communities in human history developed here, in the foothills where reliable water came down from the mountains. Long before anyone called this place Persia, long before anyone called it Iran, people were already farming, trading, building, and arguing about who owned what. The name Persia itself comes from a specific region, a southwestern province the ancient inhabitants called Parsa. The Greeks, who had strong opinions about how foreign words should sound, turned it into Persis. Eventually, it became the word the whole Western world used for the entire country. The way we sometimes name a whole country after one famous corner of it. The way you might describe all of America as Hollywood or all of France as Paris, depending on your mood. But the people who actually lived there, they had their own word. They called themselves Arya. Or more precisely, they identified with a concept, a cultural and linguistic grouping that scholars now call Indo-Iranian. It is a very old identity, older than the empires, older than the kings. It connects the ancient peoples of the plateau to the Vedic cultures of South Asia through shared language roots that linguists can still trace today. The word Iran itself comes directly from this root, Aryan, land of the Aryans, in the original sense of that word, which simply meant something like noble people or our kind of people. It was a cultural designation, not a racial one, though that distinction would be catastrophically muddled by later history in ways we will get to in due time. So from the very beginning, there are two names running alongside each other. Parsa, the regional name, the one outsiders grabbed onto and turned into Persia, and Ariana, the deeper, older name, the one the people themselves carried. For thousands of years, both names existed simultaneously. Both were true. Neither was the whole story. And that tension between how a place is seen from outside and how it understands itself from within is really what tonight's story is about. The mountains around you are dark now. Somewhere to the east, The first pale suggestion of the Alborz range sits against the sky. Below, in the valleys, there are small fires. There have always been small fires here. Someone is always awake, somewhere on this plateau, tending something. Historians still debate exactly when a coherent Persian cultural identity first emerged, separate from the broader mosaic of peoples on the plateau. Some place it around 1000 BCE, when the first clear records of the Parsa people appear. Others argue the roots go back much further, woven into layers of culture we can barely see anymore. What we do know is that by the 6th century BCE, something remarkable was about to happen. A king was coming, and he would change everything. But first, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. His name was Cyrus, and if you have ever met someone who seemed to be operating on a completely different level from everyone around them, someone who walked into a room and the room quietly rearranged itself, then you have some small sense of what Cyrus the Great must have been like. He was born sometime around 600 BCE in the region of Parsa, in what is now the Fars province of southwestern Iran. His father was a Persian king of modest power. His grandfather, Astyages, was the king of the Medes, a neighboring Iranian people who had dominated the plateau for generations. The family tree was complicated, the politics were complicated, and by the time Cyrus was an adult, he had decided that the simplest solution was to conquer everyone in it. He started with his grandfather. In 550 BCE, Cyrus defeated Astyages and absorbed the Median kingdom. This was not just a military victory. It was a careful, deliberate political move. He kept Median nobles in positions of power. He respected their customs. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, someone who had simply corrected a mismanagement problem at the top. This would become his signature move. Over the next 2 decades, Cyrus built the Achaemenid Empire, named for his ancestor Achaemenids, into the largest empire the world had ever seen. He took Lydia, in what is now western Turkey, defeating the famously wealthy king Croesus. He took Babylon, one of the great cities of the ancient world, reportedly without a battle, walking in while the locals were mid-festival and apparently not entirely unhappy to see him. The Babylonian Conquest is where one of the most famous documents in early human history comes from. The Cyrus cylinder, a small baked clay barrel covered in cuneiform text, now sitting in the British Museum. In it, Cyrus describes himself as a king chosen by the gods, a bringer of peace, a respecter of local religions and customs. He announces that he is freeing peoples who had been forcibly relocated, including, according to some readings, the Jewish people held in Babylonian captivity. Some historians call the Cyrus Cylinder the world's first human rights charter. Others argue that is a generous modern reinterpretation of what was really just very sophisticated royal propaganda. The academic debate has been running for decades and shows no signs of slowing down. What everyone agrees on is that it is a remarkable object and that Cyrus was a remarkably unusual conqueror. He did not raise cities. He did not humiliate local gods. He did not force Persian culture onto the people he absorbed. He built an empire by making people feel, at least initially, that they had not really lost. His successors continued the project. Cambyses, too, added Egypt. Darius I, one of the great administrators of the ancient world, reorganized the empire into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap, essentially a regional governor who reported to the king. He built roads. He standardized weights and measures. He created a royal postal system, a chain of relay stations so efficient that a message could travel from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of days. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who was not always reliable but was rarely boring, described the Persian royal couriers with a phrase that eventually got carved into the facade of the main post office in New York City. Something about neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness stopping them. You have probably seen it. It was about the Persians first. Darius also built Persepolis. If you have ever seen images of enormous stone columns rising from a flat platform in the middle of the Iranian plateau, surrounded by carved reliefs of delegations from every corner of the ancient world bringing tribute, that is Persepolis. It was not the administrative capital. It was a ceremonial one, a place for the great festival of Nowruz, the Persian New Year, where representatives of all the subject peoples would gather to demonstrate the vast reach of the empire. Nowruz, by the way, is still celebrated today. Every year, around the spring equinox, people across Iran and much of Central Asia celebrate a holiday that has survived every conquest, every religion change, every political revolution for at least 3,000 years. That kind of continuity is worth pausing on for a moment. Some things are simply too deeply rooted to remove. The Achaemenid Empire at its height stretched from the Balkans and North Africa in the west to the Indus Valley in the east. It contained somewhere between 40 and 50 million people, roughly 40% of the entire global population at the time. No empire before it had come close to that scale. And yet it had a problem. To the west, a collection of small, perpetually quarreling city-states kept refusing to cooperate. The Greeks, Darius, tried to bring them into the fold. He sent armies across the Aegean. At Marathon, in 490 BCE, the Persians were defeated in a battle that became legend. His son Xerxes tried again, larger and louder, burning Athens in 480 BCE before eventually being turned back. The Greek wars became the story the Greeks told about themselves for centuries. The brave, small democracies resisting the vast Eastern despotism. Historians still argue about how fair that framing really is, given that the Persian Empire was, by the standards of its time, significantly more tolerant than most of its contemporaries. But stories belong to the people who survived to write them. The Achaemenid Empire would last just over 200 years. Long enough to define what Persian civilization meant. Long enough to give the world a model of administration, tolerance, and scale that would influence every empire that came after. And then a young man from Macedonia arrived with a burning torch and very ambitious plans. But that is for the next chapter of the night. There's a particular kind of irony that history enjoys. It is the kind where the person who destroys something also becomes, almost immediately, its greatest admirer. Where the conqueror walks into the conquered city, looks around at what he has just burned, and thinks, oh, this was magnificent. That is more or less what happened with Alexander. Alexander III of Macedon, Alexander the Great, as history would insist on calling him, arrived at the edges of the Persian Empire in 334 BCE with an army of around 40,000 men and an ambition so vast it is difficult to describe without it sounding like exaggeration. He was 22 years old. He had been tutored by Aristotle. He had read about Persia his entire life, mostly through Greek sources that described it as the great Eastern enemy, the empire of despotism, the thing that had burned Athens. He believed, or at least claimed to believe, that he was coming to avenge that burning. What followed was one of the most rapid military campaigns in ancient history. Within 3 years, the Achaemenid Empire, that vast administrative structure that had managed 40% of the world's population, was effectively over. The last Achaemenid king, Darius III, was defeated at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, fled eastward, and was eventually murdered by his own nobles. Alexander reportedly wept when he found the body and ordered it buried with full royal honors. He was good at gestures like that. Persepolis, however, did not fare so well. Alexander's army sacked and burned the ceremonial capital in 330 BCE. The exact reason has been debated by historians ever since. Some ancient sources say it was deliberate, a final symbolic act of revenge for the Persian burning of Athens 150 years earlier. Others suggest it was a drunken accident, possibly encouraged by an Athenian courtesan named Thais who reportedly dared Alexander to do at a party. If true, that is perhaps the most expensive dare in human history. The cedar roofs of Persepolis burned for days. The smoke was visible for miles away. The treasury was emptied. So much gold and silver that Alexander reportedly needed 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels just to carry it away. Ancient sources disagree on the exact numbers, because ancient sources always disagree on exact numbers when they are impressive enough to be suspicious. But here is the irony the history books love to linger on. Even as he burned Persepolis, Alexander was falling in love with Persia. He adopted Persian court dress. He began performing the proskynesis, a Persian gesture of respect involving bowing before the king, which scandalized his Macedonian generals, who considered it degrading. He married a Bactrian princess named Roxana. He encouraged his officers to marry Persian noblewomen. He recruited Persian soldiers into his army and incorporated Persian administrative practices into his governance. He was not destroying Persian civilization. He was trying to merge it with his own. His generals hated this. There was a growing and vocal faction among Alexander's Macedonian officers who felt that their king had gone native, that he was becoming more Persian than Greek, and that this was not the outcome they had signed up for when they crossed the Hellespont. The tension between Alexander's vision of a fused Greco-Persian civilization and his generals' more straightforward desire for Greek supremacy runs like a fault line through the last years of his campaign. Historians still argue about what Alexander actually intended. Was he genuinely committed to cultural fusion as a governing philosophy? Or was he simply a brilliant pragmatist who understood that you cannot run an empire of that size by treating half its population as inferior? The answer is probably both, tangled together in a personality that was simultaneously visionary and unstable. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE. He was 32 years old. The cause of his death remains one of history's great open questions. Typhoid fever, complicated by heavy drinking, is the most widely accepted medical explanation. Poison arranged by disgruntled generals is the version that makes for better stories. A recent theory suggested a rare neurological condition may have left him in a state of suspended animation, meaning he might have been buried alive. History occasionally goes too far. What matters for our story tonight is what happened next. His empire immediately fragmented. His generals, the Didakai, the successors, divided the conquered world among themselves in a series of wars that lasted for decades. The Iranian plateau eventually came under the control of the Seleucid dynasty, founded by one of Alexander's generals, Seleucus. The Seleucids tried to maintain Alexander's vision of Hellenistic culture fused with local traditions. Greek cities were founded across Iran. Greek became the language of administration and high culture. For a time, the Iranian plateau was officially, administratively, a Greek place. But underneath the Greek surface, something was waiting. The Persian language did not disappear. The old Iranian religious traditions did not disappear. The memory of the Achaemenid kings did not disappear. It all went quiet, the way things go quiet when they're absorbing rather than surrendering. And in the eastern steppes, a nomadic Iranian people called the Parthians were watching the Seleucids carefully, noting their weaknesses and making plans. The lights are lower now. The plateau is quiet under its enormous sky. Something is always waiting in the east. You have to admire the Parthians. Not because they were the most glamorous dynasty in Iranian history. They were not. They did not build the most spectacular monuments. They did not produce the most celebrated poets. They did not leave behind the kind of grand written record that makes historians comfortable and confident. In fact, one of the persistent frustrations of studying the Parthian period is that most of what we know about them comes from their enemies, primarily the Romans, who were not exactly riding with war neutrality. And yet the Parthians held the Iranian plateau for nearly 500 years. 500 years. That is longer than the United States has existed. Longer than the Ottoman Empire at its most enduring. Longer than almost any political entity in the Western historical imagination. They did it quietly, without a great deal of fuss, And the fact that they are not household names the way the Achaemenids or the Sasanians are is itself a kind of historical injustice worth noting at the start. The Parthians were originally a semi-nomadic Iranian people from the region of Parthia, a territory sitting in what is now northeastern Iran and southern Turkmenistan. They had been vassals under the Seleucids, nominally governed, practically independent, watching from the eastern edges as the Hellenistic Empire slowly lost its coherence. Around 247 BCE, a chieftain named Arsaces led a revolt against Seleucid authority and founded what would become the Arsacid dynasty. The date is significant enough that the Parthians later used it as the starting point of their own calendar. This was a people who understood, from the very beginning, that beginnings matter. The rise was gradual. The Seleucids were distracted. They were always distracted, fighting wars on multiple fronts, squabbling over succession, slowly hemorrhaging territory in every direction. The Parthians simply kept moving westward, absorbing one province at a time, until by around 141 BCE, under King Mithridates I, they had taken the great city of Ctesiphon on the Tigris River and established it as their capital. They were now the dominant power on the Iranian plateau. What made the Parthians unusual was their system of governance, or more precisely, their deliberate looseness of governance. Where the Achaemenids had built a centralized administrative empire, the Parthians operated something closer to a feudal confederation. Regional lords, many of them from ancient Iranian noble families, retained significant autonomy. They governed their own lands, maintained their own armies, collected their own taxes, and owed loyalty to the Arsacid king in a relationship that was more partnership than subjugation. Modern historians debate whether this was a deliberate political philosophy or simply a practical accommodation of the realities of ruling such a vast and diverse territory. The answer is probably that it started as the latter and gradually became the former, the way many political arrangements calcify from necessity into ideology. The system had obvious weaknesses. A king who lost the confidence of the great noble families was a king in serious trouble. Parthian history is littered with royal depositions, civil wars, and rival claimants backed by competing noble factions. The throne was never entirely secure, but the system also had a remarkable resilience. When the center wobbled, the periphery held, and the empire as a whole kept functioning even when the king did not. And then there were the Romans. From roughly 53 BCE onward, Rome and Parthia were in an almost constant state of conflict, competition, and occasionally catastrophic military confrontation. The most famous early episode was the Battle of Carrhae, where a Roman army under the general Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in the ancient world, a man financing his own military adventure in pursuit of glory, marched into Parthian territory and was comprehensively destroyed. The Parthian cavalry, particularly their famous heavily armored cataphracts and their light horse archers, proved devastatingly effective against Roman infantry formations. The horse archers in particular employed a tactic that passed into the English language as the Parthian shot, the ability to fire arrows accurately backward while retreating at full gallop, making pursuit almost suicidal. Crassus was killed. His army was shattered. The Roman standards were captured and displayed in Parthia for decades, a humiliation that gnawed at Roman pride across multiple generations of emperors. Historians still debate the precise numbers at Carrhae, as they always do with ancient battles, but the strategic significance is not in question. The Parthians established, definitively and expensively, that the Iranian plateau was not a place Rome could simply absorb on its eastern march. Here is the eccentric detail that deserves a moment. According to one ancient Chinese source, some of the Roman prisoners captured at Carrhae were eventually transported east across the Silk Road and settled in Central Asia as a frontier garrison. A small Chinese village called Liqian has been claimed, with varying degrees of academic seriousness, to be descended from these lost Roman soldiers. DNA studies have been inconclusive, The claim is almost certainly exaggerated, but the fact that it is even plausible that a Roman prisoner from a battle in what is now Turkey could plausibly end up in a village in western China tells you something important about how connected the ancient world already was. The Parthians sat at the center of that connectivity. They controlled the Silk Road routes. They taxed the trade moving between Rome and China, between India and the Mediterranean. They were, in a very real sense, the brokers of the ancient world's most valuable commercial network. And they did it for 5 centuries while Rome battered at their western frontier and the great nomadic peoples of the steppe pressed from the north. The fire in the plateau hearth burns low and steady tonight. Something older than Rome is keeping alive. Every few centuries, history seems to decide that a place has been patient long enough, that the quiet accumulation of cultural memory, the slow preservation of language and identity under foreign or semi-foreign rule, has finally reached a tipping point, that it is time, once again, for something to announce itself loudly and deliberately to the world. That is what the Sasanian Empire was. It began in the same place the Achaemenid Empire had begun, the province of Fars in southwestern Iran, the old heartland of Parsa, the original Persia. A local ruler named Ardashir I, from a family with priestly connections to the Zoroastrian fire temple at Istakhr, had been quietly consolidating power in the region for years. In 224 CE, he defeated and killed the last Parthian king, Artabanus IV, in battle. The Arsacid dynasty, 5 centuries old, ended in an afternoon. Ardashir was not modest about what he was doing. He presented himself explicitly as the heir to the Achaemenids, the restorer of genuine Persian imperial tradition after what he characterized as centuries of foreign and semi-foreign interruption. The Parthians, despite being Iranian themselves, were from the northeast, from the steppe edges of the plateau. Ardashir was from the ancient Persian heartland, and he wanted everyone to know the difference. He founded the Sasanian dynasty, named for his grandfather Sasan, and set about building an empire that would last over 400 years and reach a grandeur that genuinely rivaled anything the ancient world had previously produced. His son Shapur I extended the empire aggressively. In one of the most stunning military achievements of the ancient world, Shapur defeated and captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in 260 CE, the only time in Roman history that a reigning emperor was taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. Shapur commemorated this moment with enormous rock reliefs carved directly into cliff faces at Nakshi Rostam, near Persepolis, showing the Roman emperor kneeling before the Persian king. Those carvings are still there today. You can visit them. The Sasanians built their empire around a clearly defined Persian identity in a way the Parthians never had. The Persian language, Middle Persian, called Pahlavi, became the official administrative and literary language of the empire. Zoroastrianism was elevated to the status of state religion, with a formal priestly class, the Magi, wielding significant political influence alongside the throne. This was a genuinely new development in Iranian history. Previous Persian empires had been notably tolerant of diverse religious practices. The Sasanians were not exactly intolerant. The empire contained large communities of Christians, Jews, Buddhists, and Manichaeans who generally practiced without systematic persecution. But the centering of Zoroastrianism as the official state religion gave the empire a distinct ideological character it had not previously possessed. Historians debate whether this religious centralization strengthened or ultimately weakened the empire. It certainly created a more unified cultural identity. It also created tensions with religious minorities and, eventually, with the Arab Muslim armies who would arrive from the southwest in the 7th century carrying a very different theological message. But that is still a few sections away. For now, let us stay in the Sasanian world a little longer because it deserves the attention. Sasanian art is among the most beautiful produced anywhere in the ancient world. Their metalwork, silver plates and bowls decorated with hunting scenes, royal banquets, mythological imagery, ended up in collections across Europe and Asia, traded, and gifted along the Silk Road for centuries after the empire itself had ended. When medieval European craftsmen wanted to depict luxury and refinement, they often copied Sasanian design patterns without necessarily knowing where they came from. The Sasanian capital, Ctesiphon, inherited from the Parthians and expanded dramatically, contained what was at the time the largest single-span brick vault ever constructed. The Qajars, the Great Arch of Ctesiphon, rose to a height of roughly 37 meters. Much of it still stands in what is now Iraq, quietly surviving centuries of flood, war, and neglect, still the largest ancient brick vault in the world. There is also a peculiar and wonderful story about the Sasanian king Khosrow I, who ruled in the 6th century CE and is remembered in Iranian tradition as Anushirvan, the immortal soul. He was, by most accounts, a genuinely exceptional administrator and patron of learning. Under his rule, scholars fleeing the closing of the Platonic Academy in Athens, which the Byzantine Emperor Justinian shut down in 529 CE, were welcomed at the Sasanian court. Persian scholars and Greek philosophers, sitting together in Ctesiphon, comparing notes on medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. There is something deeply pleasing about that image. Khosrow reportedly negotiated with Justinian specifically to protect the right of these Greek scholars to return home without persecution. He made it a condition of a peace treaty. A Persian king inserting the intellectual freedom of Greek philosophers into an international diplomatic agreement. Historians still debate how much of this account is idealized legend and how much is historical record. The sources are partial and sometimes contradictory. But the broader truth, that the Sasanian court was a genuine center of learning, translation, and intellectual exchange, is well established. The Sasanian Empire reached its greatest territorial extent under Khosrow II in the early 7th century, briefly capturing Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia from Byzantium. It must have seemed, for a moment, like the empire was invincible, but the overextension was severe. The wars with Byzantium had drained both sides, and in the desert to the southwest, in the Arabian Peninsula, something entirely new was gathering itself. A revelation, a community, a force that neither Persia nor Byzantium had thought to prepare for. The night is very quiet now. Listen carefully. There's a moment in the life of every great empire when the machinery that has always worked suddenly does not. When the tax collectors still ride out, the soldiers still march, the scribes still write their careful reports. And yet something fundamental has shifted. A loosening, invisible from the inside, that only becomes apparent when the pressure arrives from outside. The Sasanian Empire in the 630 CE was exactly that kind of empire. For centuries of glory, of magnificent art and architecture, of philosophical exchange and royal pageantry, of rock-carved victories and silver plates depicting eternal kings, have been followed by 2 decades of catastrophic internal instability. Between 628 and 632 CE, the Sasanian throne changed hands at least 8 times. There were coups, counter-coups, child kings, queen regents, and powerful noble families pulling strings from every direction simultaneously. The imperial treasury was drained from the long, grinding wars with Byzantium. The army was exhausted in the particular way that armies become exhausted not just from fighting, but from being asked to fight without purpose or end. The administrative structures that had held the empire together across 4 centuries were fraying visibly at every joint. Into this fragility came the Arab armies. The emergence of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula under the Prophet Muhammad is one of the most significant events in human history, and it happened with a speed that startled everyone, including, arguably, the people it was happening to. Within a decade of Muhammad's death in 632 CE, the early Muslim community under the first caliphs had launched military campaigns in multiple directions simultaneously, into Byzantine Syria, into Egypt, and directly into the Sasanian heartland of Mesopotamia. The Sasanians received their full attention. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, fought in what is now southern Iraq, in 636 CE. The Sasanian forces were commanded by a respected general named Rostam Farrukhzad, leading an army that included war elephants, an impressive and terrifying sight that, according to some ancient accounts, briefly threw the Arab cavalry into confusion before the Arab commanders adapted their tactics with remarkable speed. The battle lasted several days. It was hard, costly, and close in ways that later triumphalist accounts prefer to gloss over. Rostam Farrukhzad was killed. The Sasanian formation collapsed. The Arab armies poured into Mesopotamia. Within 2 years, Ctesiphon itself had fallen. The last Sasanian emperor, Yazdijerd III, fled eastward across the plateau in a retreat that stretched across years and thousands of miles, appealing to provincial governors for support, finding less and less with every passing season. He was murdered in 651 CE near the city of Merv, in what is now Turkmenistan, reportedly killed by a local miller who did not recognize him and wanted his fine clothes. One of the greatest empires in human history ended in an anonymous roadside killing by someone who did not know who he was dealing with. History does not always arrange itself dramatically. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating and where the Iranian experience diverges sharply from what happened in many other places the Arab armies conquered. The Arab conquest of the Iranian plateau was a decisive military victory. It was not a cultural erasure. Persian did not become Arabic. The Iranians did not abandon their language, their literary traditions, their ancient seasonal festivals, or their pre-Islamic cultural memories. They converted to Islam, a process that was gradual, uneven, geographically patchy, and took at least 2 full centuries to reach anything resembling widespread completion. But they converted as Persians. They brought their existing intellectual and cultural frameworks with them into the new faith, and those frameworks quietly began reshaping the environment they entered. This dynamic is one of the most discussed and debated in all of Islamic history. Why did Persian culture survive so robustly when so many other conquered cultures were more thoroughly absorbed into Arab Islamic identity? Historians point to several intersecting factors. The extraordinary depth and prestige of Persian literary and administrative tradition made it resistant to simple displacement. The sheer geographic size and population density of the Iranian plateau made total cultural replacement a logistical impossibility. And crucially, the early Islamic Caliphate needed Persian administrative expertise with an urgency it could not afford to ignore. The Arab conquerors were extraordinary soldiers, and they carried a transformative religious vision. They were not, at least initially, experienced imperial administrators capable of managing a bureaucratic structure of Sasanian complexity. The Persian scribes, tax assessors, provincial administrators, and court officials found that their specialized skills were suddenly in very high demand under the new management. They converted. They kept their positions. They kept their language in daily practical use. And they began, quietly and with considerable sophistication, to shape the civilization forming around them from the inside. The eccentric footnote to this entire transformation involves the Zoroastrian communities who refused conversion entirely. Rather than submit, a determined group departed from the Iranian coastline, crossed the Arabian Sea by ship, and landed in northwestern India sometime in the 8th or 10th century. The exact date is itself an academic debate. Their descendants became the Parsis, the Persians of India, a small and extraordinarily resilient community centered around Mumbai, who have maintained Zoroastrian religious practice continuously for over 1,000 years in voluntary exile from the homeland that produced them. They carried the sacred fires with them across the ocean. And on the plateau they left behind, other kinds of fire, literary, linguistic, intellectual, were being carefully maintained as well, tended by people who understood, with a cultural instinct sharpened by centuries of practice, that surviving a conquest was not the same thing as surrendering to one. Persia had done this before. It was already preparing to do it again. There is a phenomenon that historians sometimes call reverse cultural assimilation. It is the process by which a conquered people, rather than being absorbed into the culture of their conquerors, gradually and quietly pull the conquerors into their own cultural orbit instead. It happens when the conquered civilization is old enough, deep enough, and self-assured enough to recognize that military defeat and cultural defeat are entirely separate things, and that the second does not necessarily follow from the first. The Persians had been practicing this for centuries. They had done a version of it with Alexander. They had done a version of it with the Seleucids. They had watched the Parthians, themselves Iranian, but culturally distinct from the old Persian heartland, gradually adopt Persian administrative language and courtly traditions. Each time, the pattern repeated. Each time, the surface changed and the substrate endured. With the Arab conquest, the process reached its most elaborate and consequential expression. The first century after the conquest was genuinely difficult. Arabic was the language of the Quran, of religious practice, of the new ruling class, and of the administrative apparatus that the early caliphate built across its vast territories. Persian was not suppressed exactly, but it occupied a reduced and uncomfortable position. To advance in the new world, to participate in the intellectual and religious life of the caliphate, a Persian scholar needed to work in Arabic first. And so they did. Persian scholars, scientists, theologians, and administrators became some of the most important contributors to what historians now call the Islamic Golden Age. That extraordinary flowering of intellectual achievement centered roughly between the 8th and 13th centuries, when the Islamic world led the planet in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and geography. The names are worth pausing on because they're not always recognized in the West as Persian, even though they were. Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, was born near Bokhara in what is now Uzbekistan, in the Persian cultural sphere. His canon of medicine became the standard medical textbook in both the Islamic world and medieval Europe for over 600 years. He wrote primarily in Arabic, but he also wrote in Persian, and he thought within a Persian intellectual tradition that stretched back through the Sasanian academies to the ancient world. Al-Biruni, one of the greatest scholars of the medieval world, was from Khwarezm in Central Asia. He wrote in Arabic, but was Persian-speaking and Persian-cultured. He calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy in the 11th century, conducted serious comparative studies of Indian culture and religion, and produced works on astronomy, mineralogy, and pharmacology that remained authoritative for centuries. Al-Khwarizmi, from whose name the word algorithm is directly derived, gave the world algebra. His name also gave us the word algorithm itself, filtered through Latin transliteration of his name. He was from the same Central Asian Persian cultural sphere. The historian Toby Wilkinson has written about how the transmission of knowledge through this period reshaped the entire trajectory of human intellectual history. The specific mechanisms by which Persian scholars worked within Arabic scholarly frameworks, gradually expanding those frameworks, eventually helped create the conditions for the European Renaissance. Persia did not just survive the Arab conquest. It helped build the civilization that grew from it. But the cultural reclamation had a second dimension, and this one took place in the Persian language itself. Around the 9th and 10th centuries, something remarkable began to happen. New Persian, an evolved form of the Old Middle Persian language, now written in the Arabic script and enriched with a significant vocabulary of Arabic loanwords, but still fundamentally Persian in its grammar and its literary soul, began to emerge as a major literary language. The courts of the Eastern Iranian world, particularly the Samanid dynasty centered in Bokhara and Khorasan, became the incubators of this renaissance. The Samanids were a Persian dynasty operating within the framework of Islamic civilization, nominally acknowledging the Baghdad Caliphate, while pursuing an explicitly Persian cultural program in their own domains. They patronized poets who wrote in New Persian. They sponsored the translation of Arabic scholarly works into Persian. They cultivated a court culture that was consciously heir to the Sasanian tradition, connecting the Islamic present to the pre-Islamic Persian past in a chain that the Arab conquest had interrupted but not broken. The greatest product of this renaissance was Abolkasem Ferdowsi, a poet from Khorasan who spent approximately 30 years composing the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. Completed around 1010 CE, the Shahnameh is an epic poem of roughly 50,000 couplets retelling the mythological and historical kings of Iran from the creation of the world to the Arab conquest. It is one of the longest poems ever written by a single author in any language. Ferdowsi reportedly refused to simplify his language to include Arabic loanwords, insisting on using Persian vocabulary with a purity that was itself a political statement. Whether that particular story is entirely historical or partly legendary, historians still debate. What is not debated is the poem's extraordinary cultural impact. The Shahnameh kept Persian alive as a literary language with a continuous identity reaching back before Islam. It gave the Iranian world a shared cultural memory that crossed regional and dynastic boundaries. It is still read, still memorized, still performed in Iran today. 1,000 years later, Ferdowsi's Persian is still recognizable to a modern Iranian reader. Consider what that means. The language that the Arab conquest had pushed to the margins came back, ornamented with new words, written in a new script, carrying a new faith, but recognizably, unmistakably itself. The plateau breathes slowly tonight. It has learned patience across a very long time. There is a particular kind of devastation that is difficult to describe without resorting to numbers. And even the numbers, when you encounter them, feel like abstractions, like figures on a page that the mind accepts intellectually while quietly refusing to fully process, because fully processing them would be too heavy a thing to carry through an ordinary evening. So let us start with a single city, Nishapur. In the early 13th century, Nishapur was one of the great cities of the medieval world. It sat in the Khorasan region of northeastern Iran, at a crossroads of Silk Road trade routes that had been active for over 1,000 years. It had libraries, observatories, madrasas, and bazaars of legendary variety. It had produced some of the finest minds of the Islamic Golden Age. Omar Khayyam, the poet and mathematician whose Rubaiyat would eventually be read in translation across the entire world, was born there. Nishapur had a population estimated at somewhere between 100,000 and several 100,000 people, making it one of the largest urban centers on Earth at the time. In 1221, the Mongol armies arrived. What followed was not a conquest in the conventional sense. It was an erasure. Ancient sources and historians debate their reliability, as they always must with numbers of this scale, describe the Mongol commander ordering the city killed so completely that not even the cats and dogs were spared. The population was massacred. The irrigation infrastructure that had supported the city for centuries was deliberately destroyed. The libraries burned. The scholars died alongside the merchants, the craftsmen, and the children. Nishapur was not an isolated case. The Mongol campaigns across the Iranian plateau between 1219 and 1258 constituted one of the most destructive events in the history of human civilization. City after city, Merv, Balkh, Herat, Ray, was reduced to rubble and ash. The Khanate systems, the ancient underground irrigation networks that had made settled life possible across the Iranian plateau for thousands of years, were systematically dismantled. Population estimates for the Iranian plateau before and after the Mongol invasions suggest a demographic collapse of staggering proportions. Some historians argue the plateau did not recover its pre-Mongol population levels for several centuries. The Mongols were not, initially, interested in governing what they destroyed. Genghis Khan, who launched the original campaigns, operated according to a strategic logic that was brutally simple. Cities that submitted peacefully were spared and taxed. Cities that resisted were destroyed completely. as an example to every other city within hearing distance. The destruction was not irrational from a certain military perspective. It was in its terrible way a system. But systems have a habit of evolving. The generation of Mongols that came after the initial devastation found themselves in possession of an enormous territory that needed administering, taxing, and in some basic sense managing. And here, with a grim inevitability that Persian history seems to generate repeatedly, the Persians who had survived found themselves once again in possession of skills the new rulers desperately needed. The Mongol Khanate, the dynasty established in Iran by Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu, following the destruction of Baghdad in 1258, gradually transformed from a force of devastation into something recognizable as a Persian-influenced imperial court. Persian became the administrative language of the Khanate. Persian scholars, architects, and artists found patronage at the Mongol court. Persian bureaucrats managed the tax systems. Persian physicians attended the Mongol Khans. Hulagu's own wife was a Nestorian Christian. His court contained Buddhists, shamans, Christians, and Muslims simultaneously, in a religious mixture that would have been genuinely bewildering to the caliphs whose Baghdad he had burned to the ground. The Khans converted to Islam within 2 generations. The eccentric detail for this section involves the historian Rashid al-Din, a Jewish physician who converted to Islam and became the chief minister of the Mongol Khanate in the early 14th century. He commissioned and largely wrote the Jami al-Tawarik, the Compendium of Chronicles, a world history so ambitious in scope that it attempted to document not just Islamic and Persian history, but the history of China, India, Europe, and the Mongols themselves, illustrated with miniature paintings in Persian, Chinese, and European style simultaneously. A Jewish-born Persian Muslim administrator working for Mongol rulers produced the first genuinely global history ever attempted. Historians still debate how much of the text Rashid al-Din personally wrote versus compiled and directed, and his legacy is complicated by the fact that he was eventually executed by his own government on charges of poisoning a previous Khan, which he almost certainly did not do. History, as noted before, does not always treat its most interesting people well. The Mongol period also produced, paradoxically, one of the great flowerings of Persian miniature painting. Protected within the covers of manuscripts, these tiny, extraordinarily detailed illustrations depicted gardens, court scenes, battles, and mythological episodes from the Shahnameh and other Persian classics with a delicacy and color intensity that still astonishes museum visitors today. The Mongol courts, despite their origins in destruction, became extraordinary patrons of this intimate art form. It is one of the more disorienting paradoxes of Iranian history. The people who burned the libraries eventually funded the illuminated manuscripts that replaced them. The plateau has a long memory. It has learned to find beauty in unexpected places, to locate the thread of continuity, even when the surface of things has been completely destroyed and rebuilt from rubble. By the 14th century, the Khanate had fragmented. New dynasties were forming in the wreckage: Jalayirids, Muzaffarids, Karts, all of them operating in Persian, all of them patronizing Persian culture, all of them building on foundations that the Mongols had tried and failed to permanently erase. Another wave was coming from the east, under a conqueror named Timur. But even Timur, even Tamerlane, even that second catastrophe would not finish what Genghis Khan had started. Some roots go too deep. Every civilization, at some point, needs a moment of deliberate self-definition. Not just survival, not just continuity, but a conscious, forceful declaration of what it is, what it believes, and how it intends to present itself to the world going forward. A moment where the accumulated weight of centuries of invasion, absorption, adaptation, and resilience crystallizes into something specific and intentional. For Iran, that moment was the Safavid dynasty, and the instrument of that self-definition was not a language or a poem or an architectural program, although all of those followed. It was a theological decision, a declaration of religious identity so consequential that it still shapes the political and cultural geography of the Middle East today, more than 500 years after it was made. In 1501, a young man named Ismail, just 14 or 15 years old by most accounts, the leader of a Sufi religious order with a fervent following, rode into the city of Tabriz at the head of an army of devoted followers called the Qizilbash, the Redheads, named for their distinctive crimson headgear. He declared himself Shah of Iran, and then he declared something else. He declared 12er Shia Islam, the official state religion of Iran. This was not a minor administrative decision. At the time, the vast majority of the Iranian plateau's population was Sunni Muslim, as was the overwhelming majority of the Islamic world surrounding it. The Ottoman Empire to the west was Sunni. The Uzbek Confederation to the northeast was Sunni. Ismail was announcing, in the most public and consequential way imaginable, that Iran was going to be different. Historians still debate the precise motivations behind this declaration. Some emphasize the genuinely held religious convictions of Ismail and the Qizilbash, whose devotion to the Shia imams was deep and emotionally intense. Some of the Qizilbash apparently believed Ismail himself was a divine figure, a belief he did little initially to discourage. Others focus on the political logic, arguing that adopting a distinct religious identity was a sophisticated strategy for differentiating the new Iranian state from its powerful Sunni neighbors and creating a unique basis for loyalty and cohesion. The answer is almost certainly both, layered together in the way that religious conviction and political calculation have always been layered together throughout human history, often indistinguishably. What is beyond debate is the scale of the transformation that followed. The Safavids did not simply announce Shia Islam and wait for the population to quietly adjust. They actively promoted it, enforced it, built institutions around it, imported Shia scholars from Arab regions of the Middle East, particularly from what is now Lebanon and Bahrain, where Shia communities had long existed, to staff the new religious establishment. They built shrines, endowed seminaries, commissioned theological texts, and made the veneration of the imams and their descendants a central feature of Iranian public and private life. Within 2 or 3 generations, Iran was genuinely, deeply majority Shia. The speed and completeness of this transformation still impresses historians of religion. A country's majority confession changed in less than a century, not primarily through violence, though there was some, but through sustained institutional effort, patronage, and a gradual internalization of a new religious framework by a population that had always been, in some sense, searching for a distinctly Iranian form of Islamic expression. Because here is the quietly important thing about Shia Islam as it developed in Iran. The emphasis on martyrdom, on suffering, on the figure of the wronged and righteous leader whose cause is just even when the world refuses to recognize it. These themes resonated with extraordinary depth in a culture that had spent over 1,000 years watching its civilizations rise, flourish, and be destroyed by outside forces. The grief of Karbala, the central Shia narrative of the martyrdom of Imam Hussein in 680 CE, mapped onto the Iranian cultural memory with an intimacy that purely political analysis cannot fully explain. It was not just a religion. It was a language for experiences the Iranian plateau had been accumulating for centuries. The Safavid dynasty also produced some of the most spectacular architecture in human history. Shah Abbas I, who ruled from 1588 to 1629 and is generally considered the greatest of the Safavid monarchs, rebuilt the city of Isfahan into one of the most beautiful urban environments ever created. The Naqshi Jahan Square, the image of the world square, at the heart of Isfahan is still standing, still largely intact, still one of the largest public squares on earth. It is surrounded by the Sheikh Lat Falam Mosque, the Sham Mosque, the Ali Kapo Palace, and the Royal Bazaar, each one a masterpiece of tile work, calligraphy, and geometric design. The eccentric detail for this section involves Shah Abbas and his remarkably sophisticated foreign policy, which included sending an Armenian Christian nobleman named Robert Shirley, an Englishman who had arrived at the Safavid court as a kind of freelance military advisor, on diplomatic missions to European courts on behalf of the Persian throne. An English Catholic adventurer representing the Shia Persian emperor to the kings of Europe, pitching an alliance against their common Ottoman enemy. The 17th century was a complicated time. Shah Abbas also deliberately moved entire communities around his empire for strategic purposes, relocating Armenian Christian artisans to Isfahan to staff his silk industry, creating the suburb of New Julfa that still exists today as a historic Armenian Christian community within an Iranian city. The Safavid period created the geographic, religious, and cultural outlines of the Iran that exists today. The borders, the religious identity, the administrative traditions, even the aesthetic sensibility of modern Iran all have deep Safavid roots. When a modern Iranian says they are Iranian and Shia in the same breath, without feeling any tension between those two identities, they're living inside a frame that Shah Ismail built in Tabriz in 1501. The image of the world square is lit tonight by a pale moon. The blue tiles hold the light quietly, the way this land has always held things. There are people who arrive in history like a sudden change in weather. No gradual build-up, no slow accumulation of circumstance that allows the world around them to adjust. Just a stillness, and then a violence of transformation, and then a stillness again, but a different stillness in a different world with different borders and different rulers and a different understanding of what is possible. Nader Shah was that kind of person. He was born around 1688 in the Khorasan region of northeastern Iran, into a family of modest means from the Afshar tribe, a Turkic-speaking group who had long been part of the Kizilbash military confederation that supported the Safavid throne. His early life was genuinely difficult. Ancient sources suggest he spent time as a slave after being captured in a raid, and that he escaped and gradually built a following among the tribal fighters of the Northeast through sheer force of personal magnetism and military talent. By the time he entered the larger stage of Iranian history, he was already someone that careful observers were watching very closely. The Safavid dynasty that had built the magnificent Isfahan he would later use as his own stage was, by the early 18th century, in serious decline. The later Safavid Shahs had become increasingly isolated within their palace complexes, surrounded by court factions, harem politics, and religious establishment figures who had effectively captured the levers of government. The army had atrophied. The provincial administration was riddled with corruption and incompetence. In 1722, the Afghans came. A tribal confederation from the east, the Hataki Afghans, launched an invasion that the weakened Safavid state proved completely unable to resist. They captured Isfahan, besieged the city into a famine that killed tens of thousands of its inhabitants, and reduced the Safavid Shah, Sultan Hussein, to the humiliation of formally surrendering his crown. The image of the world was occupied by foreign soldiers. It was into this crisis that Nader entered, presenting himself initially as a restorer of Safavid legitimacy, a military commander who would drive out the Afghans and return Iran to its proper rulers. He was spectacularly successful. Within a few years, he had expelled the Afghans, fought off Ottoman incursions from the west, and pushed back Russian forces that had taken advantage of the chaos to seize territory along the Caspian coast. He did all three things essentially simultaneously. He then made the Safavid figurehead, Shah Tahmasp II, watch while he personally campaigned, and when Tahmasp made an embarrassing peace treaty with the Ottomans while Nader was otherwise occupied, Nader deposed him, installed Tahmasp's infant son as a nominal puppet, and governed as regent for several years before the inevitable final step. In 1736, Nader Shah declared himself Shah of Iran. The Safavid dynasty, 235 years old, ended with a political formality that Nader had been engineering for years. He immediately did something that startled the entire Islamic world. He proposed to the Ottomans that Twelver Shia Islam, The state religion, the Safavids, had spent over 2 centuries embedding into Iranian identity, be recognized as a fifth legitimate school of Sunni Islamic jurisprudence. The Jafari school, he called it after the sixth Shia imam. Historians still debate what Nader actually intended with this proposal. Some argue he was genuinely trying to reduce the sectarian tension between Iran and its Sunni neighbors that had fueled a century of costly warfare. Others suggest it was a calculated move to reduce the political power of the Shia clerical establishment within Iran, which he correctly identified as a competing center of authority. Others still argue it was primarily a diplomatic gambit designed to justify returning conquered territories to the Ottomans without losing face. The Ottomans declined the proposal. The Shia clerical establishment was deeply suspicious of it. And Nader moved on because Nader was always moving. His campaigns were extraordinary in their geographic reach. He pushed into Central Asia, subduing the Uzbek Khanates. He invaded the Caucasus. He campaigned repeatedly against the Ottomans. And then, in 1739, he did something that no Iranian ruler before or since has managed. He invaded India. The Mughal Empire, once the most powerful state in Asia, had by the 18th century entered its own long decline. The reigning Mughal emperor, Muhammad Shah, found himself facing an army under Nader Shah that moved with a speed and tactical sophistication the Mughal forces could not match. At the Battle of Karnal, north of Delhi, the Mughal army was defeated decisively and swiftly. Nader entered Delhi. What followed is the episode for which he is most remembered outside Iran, and it is not a comfortable memory. Following a riot in the city in which some of his soldiers were killed, Nader ordered a massacre of Delhi's civilian population that lasted several hours and killed somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people. The historical sources vary on the numbers, as they always do, but the event is documented consistently enough to be beyond serious dispute. He then stripped Delhi of wealth that beggared description. The Peacock Throne, the jeweled seat of the Mughal emperors that has become one of history's most famous symbols of royal opulence, was carried back to Iran. So was the Koh-i-Noor diamond, currently sitting with magnificent historical irony in the British Crown Jewels in London, and the Darya-i-Noor, the Sea of Light diamond, which is currently in the Iranian Crown Jewels in Tehran. The eccentric detail, and in this case, it is also a genuinely poignant one, is that Nader reportedly told his courtiers after the Delhi campaign that he had brought back enough wealth that Iran would not need to collect taxes for 3 years. He kept that promise. His empire, at its greatest extent, was the last great Iranian imperial expansion. But the same qualities that made him extraordinary, the restless aggression, the inability to delegate or trust, the increasingly paranoid violence toward anyone he suspected of disloyalty, made sustained governance almost impossible. He was assassinated by his own officers in 1747. His empire dissolved within years. The plateau was exhausted again, and in the quiet that followed, new forces were already gathering in the wings, carrying with them the first distant sounds of a very different world approaching from the west. After the violence and velocity of Nader Shah, Iran needed rest. It did not get very much. The decades following Nader's assassination in 1747 were a period of fragmentation, civil war, and competing dynastic claims that historians sometimes group under the general heading of the Zand Interlude, a relatively benign period under a ruler named Karim Khan Zand, who governed much of Iran from Shiraz with a genuine concern for the welfare of ordinary people that was unusual enough in the context of Iranian dynastic history to deserve specific mention. Karim Khan never took the title of Shah. He called himself Vakil, the regent, on the grounds that he was governing on behalf of the absent Safavid line. Whether this was genuine constitutional scruple or sophisticated political positioning is, as always, a matter of historical debate. What is agreed upon is that his reign was one of relative peace, reasonable taxation, and modest prosperity, and that when he died in 1779, the Iranians who had lived under him remembered him with genuine warmth. History in this part of the world tends to remember kindly anyone who did not destroy things. The Qajars were waiting. The Qajar tribe, another Turkic-speaking group from the Caspian region with deep roots in the old Kizilbash military tradition, had been one of the competing factions throughout the post-Nader chaos. Their founding ruler, Aga Muhammad Khan, was one of the more terrifying figures in Iranian history, a man of formidable military ability and almost pathological cruelty, whose campaign to reunify Iran left a trail of destroyed cities and massacred populations that contemporaries recorded with horrified detail. He was assassinated in 1797, having ruled long enough to establish the dynasty and fix Tehran as the new capital, but not long enough to do much else. His successors were, on the whole, a more conventional collection of monarchs, and it was under his successors that Iran encountered, with gathering force and bewildering speed, the thing that would define the next century and a half of its existence: the modern world. The 19th century arrived in Iran not as an abstraction, but as a series of concrete and humiliating shocks. The Russo-Persian Wars of 1804 to 1813 and 1826 to 1828 resulted in the Treaty of Gulistan and the Treaty of Turkmenchay, through which Iran was forced to cede enormous territories in the Caucasus, what are now Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, to the Russian Empire. The terms also granted Russian citizens extraordinary legal privileges within Iran, a provision known as capitulation, meaning Russian nationals in Iran were subject to Russian law rather than Iranian law. The British Empire, meanwhile, was pressing from the south and east, deeply concerned about Russian expansion toward India, and determined to keep Iran as a buffer state between Russian ambitions and the crown jewel of the British imperial system. Iran found itself in the precise geographic position of being the contested middle ground between two expanding European empires, neither of which was particularly interested in Iranian sovereignty as a value in itself. This geopolitical squeeze produced a phenomenon that Iranian historians call the Great Game from the Iranian perspective: a century of foreign interference, unequal treaties, economic concessions extracted under pressure, and periodic humiliation that left deep scars in the Iranian national consciousness that are still visible today. The concessions were particularly galling. In 1872, the Qajar Shah Nader al-Din Shah granted a concession to a British subject named Baron Julius de Ruyter that was so comprehensive it essentially handed the economic infrastructure of the entire country to a foreign private interest. The concession covered railways, mines, factories, irrigation works, and the National Bank. Lord Curzon, the British statesman and future Viceroy of India, described it as the most complete surrender of the entire industrial resources of a kingdom to foreign hands ever recorded in history. Even the British were embarrassed by it. The concession was eventually cancelled under massive domestic pressure, but it established a pattern that would repeat throughout the Qajar period: foreign interests identifying valuable Iranian resources, extracting concessions from a cash-strapped and politically weak court, and the Iranian population responding with waves of protest that the government lacked the strength to either satisfy or suppress. The eccentric detail for this section is the tobacco protest of 1891 and 1892, when Nader al-Din Shah granted a complete monopoly over the production, sale, and export of Iranian tobacco to a British company. The response was unlike anything the Qajar court had anticipated. A fatwa, a religious ruling, issued by the senior Shia cleric Mirza Hassan Shirazi, declared the use of tobacco forbidden for as long as the concession stood. Iranians across the country stopped smoking. Even the women of the royal harem, according to contemporary accounts, extinguished their water pipes in compliance with the ruling. It was a nationwide consumer boycott organized through the religious establishment, and it worked. The Shah canceled the concession. The episode demonstrated two things with lasting significance. First, that the Shia clerical establishment in Iran had the organizational capacity and popular authority to mobilize the entire country against government policy. Second, that foreign economic concessions were a political flashpoint of extraordinary sensitivity in Iranian public life. Both of those lessons would be remembered. In 1901, a British businessman named William Knox D'Arcy obtained a concession to explore for oil across most of Iran. In 1908, his prospectors struck oil in Khuzestan in southwestern Iran, the first major commercial oil discovery in the Middle East. The world had not previously understood what it was about to do to this ancient plateau, but the plateau was about to find out. The ground beneath the oldest continuously inhabited landscape in the world had been quietly holding something that the industrial age had decided it could not live without. And that discovery would bring more foreign shadows, longer and darker than any that had come before. There is a particular kind of national humiliation that accumulates slowly. It does not arrive in a single catastrophic moment, the way a military defeat does, or a famine, or a foreign occupation. It builds instead through a series of smaller indignities, each one manageable in isolation, each one survivable on its own terms, but collectively forming a weight that a generation eventually decides it can no longer carry without doing something about it. By the early 20th century, Iran had been accumulating that weight for a very long time. The constitutional revolution of 1905 to 1911 had been Iran's first serious attempt to address the structural problems that had made it so vulnerable to foreign pressure throughout the Qajar period. Iranians from remarkably diverse backgrounds, merchants, clerics, intellectuals, tribal leaders, and ordinary townspeople, had come together to demand a constitution, a parliament, and the rule of law as constraints on royal power. They largely succeeded, at least on paper. Iran got its constitution in 1906, one of the first countries in Asia to do so. But the constitutional experiment was fragile from the beginning. The parliament, the Majlis, struggled to assert itself against a Qajar court that accepted constitutional constraints primarily when it had no other choice. The Russians and the British, deeply uncomfortable with the prospect of a stable, self-governing Iran that might start making independent decisions about its own resources, actively worked to undermine the constitutional government. In 1907, without consulting Iran, Britain and Russia signed the Anglo-Russian Convention, dividing Iran into spheres of influence: a Russian sphere in the north, a British sphere in the south, and a nominally neutral middle zone that both parties reserve the right to enter when convenient. The Iranians were not invited to the conversation about the division of their own country. The First World War brought further devastation. Iran declared neutrality and was ignored. Russian, British, and Ottoman forces all operated on Iranian soil. The country experienced famine, disease, and economic collapse. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 2 and 10 million Iranians died during the war years from a combination of violence, starvation, and the influenza pandemic, a range that is itself a measure of how completely the country's administrative capacity had broken down. Out of this collapse, a soldier emerged. Reza Khan was a military officer from a modest background in the Mazandaran region near the Caspian coast, who had risen through the ranks of the Persian Cossack Brigade, an Iranian force trained and initially officered by Russians, which was about as good a summary of the Qajar period's contradictions as anything else available. He was physically imposing, personally intimidating, and possessed of a driving, impatient ambition to modernize Iran by force if necessary. In 1921, he participated in a coup that reorganized the Iranian government. By 1923, he was prime minister. In 1925, the last Qajar Shah was deposed by vote of the Majlis, and Reza Khan crowned himself Reza Shah Pahlavi, founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, choosing a dynastic name that deliberately evoked the ancient Middle Persian language of the Sasanian era. He was reaching back across the centuries, past the Qajars, past the Safavids, past the Arab conquest, to connect his new Iran directly to its pre-Islamic imperial heritage. The modernization program he launched was comprehensive, rapid, and frequently brutal in its implementation. He built roads and railways, most significantly the Trans-Iranian Railway, an engineering achievement of genuine ambition that connected the Caspian coast to the Persian Gulf across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. He established modern schools and universities. He sent Iranian students abroad to study in Europe by the thousands. He created a centralized bureaucracy, a national army, and a judicial system based on European models. He also attacked the power of the Shia clerical establishment with considerable vigor, reducing their control over education, law, and public life in ways that generated lasting resentment in the religious community. And in March 1935, he did something that seems small from the outside, but carried an enormous weight of intention. He formally requested that foreign governments use the name Iran rather than Persia when referring to his country. The request went out through diplomatic channels to all countries with which Iran maintained relations. It was a simple administrative notification, a few paragraphs, quietly filed and quickly implemented in most capitals. Within a year, the change was largely complete in official correspondence and international usage. But the reasoning behind it was anything but simple. Reza Shah's government offered a clear explanation. Iran, derived from the ancient Ariana, land of the Aryans, was a name Iranians had always used for themselves. Persia was a name imposed from outside, taken from the single province of Fars and applied by Greeks and then Europeans to the entire country, in the same way a foreigner might call all of America by the name of one of its states. Using Iran was an act of self-naming, a declaration that the country would henceforth be known by the name its own people had always given it. There was also, historians note carefully, a contemporary ideological dimension that requires honest acknowledgement. The 1930s were a period in which Aryan racial ideology was at the height of its influence in European political thought, and the Nazi government in Germany was actively cultivating relationships with Iran, partly on the basis of supposed shared Aryan heritage. Some historians argue that the name change had at least a partial resonance with these ideological currents, presenting Iran as a nation of ancient Aryan identity. Reza Shah's government denied this interpretation explicitly, and most Iranian historians today emphasize that the use of Aryan in the Iranian context predates European racial theory by thousands of years and carries entirely different cultural meanings. The academic debate about the relative weight of these motivations continues. What is certain is that the name change stuck. What is also certain is that Reza Shah's reign ended abruptly in 1941 when British and Soviet forces invaded Iran to secure its supply routes during the Second World War, deposed him, and sent him into exile. He had spent his reign trying to free Iran from foreign interference. He was removed from power by foreign interference. The plateau has always understood irony. Every long journey needs a final passage, not an ending exactly, because the story of a civilization that has been continuously inhabited for 10,000 years does not end. It only pauses between chapters, but a closing of the particular arc we have been following tonight. The arc that began with a word, with Parsa and Ariana, with two names running alongside each other across millennia, each one carrying a different truth about the same place. Tonight, that arc reaches its final turn. Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, the son Reza Shah left behind when the British and Soviets sent him into exile in 1941, inherited a throne at 21 years old in a country occupied by foreign troops, politically fractured and economically exhausted. He would rule Iran for 37 years, until 1979, and his reign would contain within it almost every contradiction that Iranian history had been accumulating since the beginning. The early years were unstable. The most consequential episode of his early reign came in 1951, when the Iranian parliament, under the leadership of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, voted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. the British enterprise that had been extracting Iranian oil since the Darcy Concession of 1901, returning to Iran a share of the profits that most Iranians considered insultingly small, given that the oil was underneath Iranian soil. Mossadegh was a constitutionalist, a democrat, a nationalist, and a figure of enormous popular support. His nationalization of Iranian oil was greeted with celebrations across the country. It was, in the most direct sense possible, an act of self-determination by a people who had been watching foreigners extract their natural resources for half a century. The British and Americans arranged his removal. In August 1953, a CIA and MI6 organized coup, known in Iran as the 28 Mordad coup and in Western intelligence history as Operation Ajax, overthrew the democratically elected Mossadegh and restored full power to the Shah. Mossadegh spent the rest of his life under house arrest. The oil concession was renegotiated on terms more favorable to Western interests. The coup left a wound in the Iranian national consciousness that has never fully healed. Historians still debate the precise balance of internal and external factors that made the coup possible and whether Mossadegh's government would have survived without foreign intervention. What is not seriously debated is that the intervention happened, that it was decisive, and that Iranians across the political spectrum have remembered it ever since as the moment when the promise of genuine self-determination was taken away by outside hands. Mohammad Reza Shah, restored to full power, launched his own modernization program in the 1960s and 1970s, known as the White Revolution. Land reform, women's suffrage, literacy programs, and industrial expansion transformed Iranian society with considerable speed. By the 1970s, Tehran was a modern metropolis with universities, highways, and a growing middle class. Oil revenues, dramatically increased after 1973, funded an ambitious military buildup and a cultural program that celebrated pre-Islamic Persian identity with great deliberate fanfare. The Shah threw a party in 1971 at Persepolis. The ruins of the very Palace Alexander had burned 2,000 years earlier, to celebrate 2,500 years of Iranian monarchy. It was one of the most extravagant events of the 20th century. Heads of state from around the world attended. The food was flown in from Paris. The tents were designed by a French interior decorator. The cost ran to hundreds of millions of dollars. In a country where many people were still desperately poor, it was a gesture of extraordinary political obtuseness. The Shah's government was also, by the 1970s, a dictatorship with a feared secret police force, SAVAK, whose treatment of political prisoners was documented and condemned by international human rights organizations. The combination of rapid modernization, growing inequality, political repression, cultural alienation felt by the religious establishment and the traditional classes, and the deep unhealed wound of 1953 created conditions that the Shah's government consistently underestimated. The revolution came in 1979. It came from everywhere simultaneously, from the left, from liberal nationalists who remembered Mossadegh, from the Shia religious establishment that had never accepted the reduction of clerical authority that both Pahlavi Shahs had pursued, from the urban poor crowded into Tehran's expanding shantytowns, from the bazaar merchants whose traditional economic power had been disrupted by the Shah's modernization programs. It came partly as a reclaiming of Iranian identity against what many Iranians experienced as a forced westernization that felt like another form of the foreign imposition their history had been resisting for centuries. The figure who emerged from this convergence was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a senior Shia cleric who had been in exile since 1964 after publicly opposing the Shah's policies. He returned to Tehran on February 1st, 1979, to a reception of millions of people that remains one of the largest public gatherings in recorded history. The Islamic Republic of Iran was established later that year. The eccentric and genuinely poignant detail for this final section is that the name Iran, the ancient name Reza Shah, had formally asked the world to use in 1935, The name rooted in the oldest self-identification of the people of this plateau survived the revolution entirely unchanged. The Islamic Republic kept it. The revolutionaries who dismantled almost every other symbol of the Pahlavi state found nothing to object to in the name itself. Because it was not a Pahlavi name. It was older than the Pahlavis, older than the Safavids, older than the Arab conquest, older than the Sasanians. It was the name the people had always given themselves, carried in the oldest layer of their cultural memory. Underneath every empire and every religion and every foreign imposition that the long centuries had brought. Ariana, the land. And so tonight's journey ends where all Iranian journeys end and begin. Not with a dynasty, not with a border, not with a flag or a revolution or a name change in a diplomatic cable, but with the plateau itself, with the mountain ranges dark against the sky, full of old light, with the salt deserts shimmering in the moonlight at the center of everything, with the Qanat water moving slowly underground through channels that have been carrying life across this land for 3,000 years, quiet and invisible and patient and endlessly persistent, with the small fires that have always been burning somewhere on this plateau, in one form or another, tended by people who understood that the most important things are the ones you carry inside, the ones no conqueror can reach. Persia became Iran the way a river becomes the sea, not by changing its nature, but by completing its journey. And now, as the last of tonight's story settles around you like dust after a long journey, there is nothing left to do but rest. You have traveled a considerable distance this evening. You have stood at the edges of empires and watched them build themselves up from nothing, from a family, from a tribe, from a single determined person on a horse in the early morning light. You have watched those empires reach their greatest extent, glittering and vast and seemingly permanent. And you have watched them come apart, slowly or suddenly, violently or quietly, leaving behind not nothing, but something, always something, that the next chapter would inherit and carry forward. That is what tonight's story was really about. Not the names of kings, though there were many kings tonight. Not the dates of battles, though there were battles enough to fill a much longer evening. But the something underneath all of it. The thread that kept running even when everything above the surface was being torn away and replaced. A language that survived every conquest. A word for paradise rooted in a garden someone tended 3,000 years ago. A name carried so deep in the cultural memory of a people that no revolution could find a reason to change it. These are not small things to carry away and to sleep. They are, in their quiet way, among the most remarkable things that human civilization has managed. The plateau is still out there tonight under its enormous sky. The mountains are dark and patient. The salt deserts are pale and wide and absolutely still. Somewhere underground, in channels older than most of the world's nations, water is moving slowly toward the light. The fires are low now. Everything that needed saying has been said. You are safe. You are still. You are exactly where you are supposed to be. Let the story carry you the rest of the way. Sweet dreams.